In this video, we're diving into the list of U.S. death row inmates scheduled for execution in 2026. These are some of the most high-profile and controversial cases in recent years, each tied to heinous crimes and the finality of capital punishment. From lethal injections to experimental methods, these executions reflect a justice system still grappling with life and death decisions. Before we break down each case, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We cover the darkest corners of the justice system and true crime history. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on who's next on death row. Richard Glossip's case has become one of the most controversial death penalty stories in modern U.S. history. Back in 1997, Glossip was convicted of orchestrating the murder of his boss, Barry Van Treese, the owner of a budget motel in Oklahoma City. According to prosecutors, Glossip hired a teenage maintenance worker, Justin Sneed, to carry out the killing in exchange for money. Sneed admitted to the brutal murder, beating Van Treese to death with a baseball bat, but claimed that Glossip had offered him $10,000 to do it. What made this case so explosive wasn't just the crime itself, but the way the conviction was secured. The entire case against Glossip rested almost solely on Sneed's testimony. There was no physical evidence linking Glossip to the murder, no DNA, no fingerprints, and no forensic trace. Over time, serious questions began to emerge about whether justice had been served. Critics pointed out that Sneed had everything to gain by testifying against Glossip. He avoided the death penalty in exchange for implicating him. In the years that followed, Glossip's legal team and a growing number of advocates pushed for a deeper investigation, arguing that key evidence had been withheld and that the trial was riddled with errors. Despite mounting pressure and multiple execution dates being set, Glossip remained on death row for more than 2 decades. He was scheduled for lethal injection multiple times, with one date proposed again for January 2026. But this wasn't just another routine execution. His case had drawn national and international attention, with bipartisan political support, religious leaders, and even the state's own attorney general expressing doubts about his guilt. In 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court finally stepped in. In a rare unanimous decision, the court vacated Richard Glossip's conviction and death sentence, ruling that his trial had been unfair due to suppressed evidence and false testimony. They ordered a retrial, but this time without the possibility of the death penalty. That decision effectively canceled the anticipated 2026 execution date, at least for now. Glossip's story is far from over. His retrial will likely play out in the coming months, and whether he walks free or faces new charges remains to be seen. What's clear is that his case has exposed serious cracks in the system, reminding us that in capital punishment, even one mistake can have deadly consequences. Michael Titius. Michael Titius was just 19 years old when he committed the crime that landed him on Missouri's death row. In June of 2000, Titius and his older friend, Roy Vance, carried out a deadly plan to break Vance out of jail. Vance had been serving a sentence for a prior offense in the Randolph County Jail in Huntsville, Missouri. The two believed they could overpower the jailers and escape undetected, but what followed was far from a clean breakout. On the morning of June 22nd, Titius entered the jail armed with a pistol. He and Vance had previously conspired through letters and phone calls, mapping out the escape and smuggling the weapon into play. Once inside, Titius encountered 2 unarmed jailers, Jason Acton and Leon Eagley. In a burst of violence that stunned even seasoned law enforcement, Titius shot and killed both men at close range. He later admitted that the attack was premeditated and that they had intended to take the keys and free Vance from his cell. However, the plan quickly unraveled. The jail doors were secured and the keys didn't work as expected. Realizing the escape had failed, Titius fled the scene. He was arrested soon after and eventually confessed to the murders. During his trial, prosecutors painted him as cold and calculated, while the defense emphasized his troubled upbringing, lack of adult guidance, and the fact that he was still a teenager at the time of the crime. His first conviction and death sentence were handed down in 2001, but after legal challenges, he was sentenced to death in a second trial. Over the years, Titius's execution has been postponed multiple times due to appeals citing intellectual disability, ineffective counsel, and mitigating circumstances related to his age and background. Nevertheless, the state of Missouri has remained firm in its pursuit of the sentence. As of now, Tisius is scheduled to be executed by lethal injection in February 2026. His case has reignited national debates around whether young offenders, especially those under 21, should be eligible for the death penalty. Supporters of clemency argue that his age, trauma history, and brain development should warrant life imprisonment instead. But for the families of the slain jailers, justice means closure, and they've waited more than 2 decades for it. Unless a court intervenes again or the governor grants clemency, Michael Tisius will face execution early in 2026, marking the end of one of Missouri's most tragic prison escape attempts turned double homicide. Ivan Cantu, Texas. Ivan Cantu's case has become one of the most debated death penalty convictions in Texas in recent years. In November 2000, Cantu was convicted for the brutal double murder of his cousin, James Mosqueda, and James's fiancée, Amy Kitchen, in their upscale Dallas area home. Prosecutors argued that Cantu committed the murders to steal drugs, jewelry, and cash, presenting the crime as a calculated move fueled by greed and a desire for quick money. The scene was grim. Both victims were shot multiple times, and according to the original investigation, Cantu later showed up wearing his cousin's Rolex and driving his vehicle. It seemed like a clear-cut case to the jury at the time. But over the past 2 decades, the story has taken a troubling turn, raising major red flags about how the case was built in the first place. Several key witnesses have since recanted or changed their testimony, and allegations of false statements, planted evidence, and suppressed information have surfaced. One of the most damning developments was the claim that the prosecution's star witness, Cantu's own ex-girlfriend, may have been coerced or incentivized to testify against him. Questions have also been raised about how investigators handled critical forensic evidence, including gunshot residue and fingerprints, which were never definitively linked to Cantu. Cantu has always maintained his innocence, and in recent years, a growing number of legal experts, activists, and even jurors from his trial have come forward to call for a halt to his execution. Despite multiple appeals and petitions, Texas has continued to push forward. As of now, Ivan Cantu is scheduled to be executed by lethal injection in March 2026. If carried out, it would mark the end of a case that many believe deserves one last chance for a full re-examination. Supporters argue this isn't about delaying justice, it's about ensuring the right man is being held accountable. Because in a system where the ultimate punishment is death, even the smallest doubt should matter. James Barber, Alabama. James Barber's case is a grim reminder of how quickly a robbery can turn into a brutal homicide. In 2001, Barber, a handyman by trade, entered the home of 75-year-old Dorothy Epps in Harvest, Alabama. What started as a planned burglary spiraled into a vicious and fatal attack. Barber beat the elderly woman to death using his fists and a claw hammer. According to prosecutors, he was desperate for money and targeted Epps, whom he had done repair work for in the past. The crime shocked the community. Dorothy Epps was well known and beloved in her neighborhood, and the sheer brutality of the attack left a lasting impact. Barber was arrested shortly afterward and confessed to the killing. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death, with his defense team citing mental health struggles and remorse as part of their appeals. For over 2 decades, Barber remained on Alabama's death row, filing multiple appeals that were all ultimately denied. His first execution date was scheduled for July 2023, but that lethal injection attempt became the subject of serious controversy. Much like Kenneth Smith's botched execution, officials struggled to insert the IV line, raising renewed concerns about Alabama's ability to carry out executions humanely and effectively. Now, in the aftermath of these failures, Alabama is turning to a new method, nitrogen hypoxia. This process, never before used in any U.S. execution, involves replacing the oxygen a person breathes with pure nitrogen, leading to unconsciousness and death from asphyxiation. The state has announced that James Barber is scheduled to be executed using nitrogen hypoxia in May 2026. His case marks another test of this experimental method, and many are closely watching how it unfolds. While officials claim it is a painless and efficient alternative, critics argue it has never been medically or legally validated. For Barber, the road to execution has been long and legally complex. But unless there's another intervention, he is set to become the second person in U.S. history to die by nitrogen gas. Kenneth Smith's name is now permanently linked to one of the most controversial execution attempts in modern U.S. history. His case began with a chilling crime back in 1988, a murder-for-hire plot that would eventually send him to Alabama's death row. Smith was one of two men hired by a pastor, Charles Sennett, to kill his wife, Elizabeth Sennett, so the pastor could collect insurance money and carry on an affair. The plan was as cold as it was calculated. Elizabeth was found brutally beaten and stabbed in her home, and investigators quickly unraveled the plot. Smith was arrested and eventually convicted for his role in the killing. The other hitman, John Forrest Parker, was executed in 2010. Smith, however, fought his sentence through years of legal appeals, arguing that his initial conviction was flawed and that he had been unfairly sentenced to death after a split jury decision, something that's now been outlawed in Alabama. Fast forward to November 2022. After more than 3 decades on death row, Alabama prepared to execute Kenneth Smith by lethal injection. But what followed was nothing short of a disaster. For nearly an hour, prison officials struggled to insert the IV line required for the execution. Smith writhed in pain as multiple failed attempts were made, and the procedure was ultimately called off. The botched execution sparked national outrage and renewed debates about the ethics and reliability of lethal injection. In response to that failed attempt, Alabama officials made a bold decision to schedule Smith's next execution using a new and highly controversial method, nitrogen hypoxia. This method involves replacing oxygen with pure nitrogen, causing unconsciousness and, ultimately, death by asphyxiation. Smith is now set to become the first person in U.S. history to be executed using this untested procedure. The expected execution date is April 2026, and many are watching closely. Legal experts, human rights groups, and medical professionals have all raised concerns about the unknown surrounding nitrogen hypoxia, how painful it might be, how reliably it works, and whether it meets constitutional standards against cruel and unusual punishment. Kenneth Smith's case isn't just about one man on death row. It's become a flashpoint in the evolving debate over how America executes its condemned. And in 2026, the entire nation may witness a new chapter in capital punishment unfold before their eyes. Ramiro Gonzalez. Ramiro Gonzalez's case stands out not just for the tragic crime he committed, but also for the unusual turn it took in the final stages of his death sentence. In 2001, Gonzalez abducted and murdered 18-year-old Bridget Townsend, a young woman from Medina County, Texas. Prosecutors said the crime was sexually motivated and premeditated. After luring Bridget into his truck under false pretenses, Gonzalez took her to a remote location where he sexually assaulted her and shot her in the head. He buried her body in a shallow grave on private property, where it remained undiscovered for nearly 2 years. He eventually confessed to the crime and led authorities to Bridget's remains. In court, he was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. His history of prior offenses and violent behavior played a major role in the jury's decision. Over the years, Gonzalez has appealed his sentence multiple times, but each attempt has failed. What brought national attention to his case in recent years, however, wasn't just the crime, but his request to donate a kidney before being executed. Gonzalez argued that he wanted to perform one final act of good and potentially save a life. The request raised ethical and medical questions that reached all the way to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. The board ultimately denied clemency, but agreed to delay his execution temporarily so medical tests could determine whether he was a suitable donor. That delay came and went, but it did not change his fate. Now, Ramiro Gonzalez is scheduled to be executed by lethal injection in June 2026. Texas has remained firm in its stance, maintaining that the nature of his crime warrants the ultimate punishment. As that date approaches, Gonzalez's case continues to spark debates, not only about justice and retribution, but also about redemption and whether a final act of generosity should ever alter the outcome of a death sentence. Ramiro Gonzalez. Ramiro Gonzalez's case stands out not just for the tragic crime he committed, but also for the unusual turn it took in the final stages of his death sentence. In 2001, Gonzalez abducted and murdered 18-year-old Bridget Townsend, a young woman from Medina County, Texas. Prosecutors said the crime was sexually motivated and premeditated. After luring Bridget into his truck under false pretenses, Gonzalez took her to a remote location where he sexually assaulted her and shot her in the head. He buried her body in a shallow grave on private property, where it remained undiscovered for nearly 2 years. He eventually confessed to the crime and led authorities to Bridget's remains. In court, he was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. His history of prior offenses and violent behavior played a major role in the jury's decision. Over the years, Gonzalez has appealed his sentence multiple times, but each attempt has failed. What brought national attention to his case in recent years, however, wasn't just the crime, but his request to donate a kidney before being executed. Gonzalez argued that he wanted to perform one final act of good and potentially save a life. The request raised ethical and medical questions that reached all the way to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. The board ultimately denied clemency, but agreed to delay his execution temporarily so medical tests could determine whether he was a suitable donor. That delay came and went, but it did not change his fate. Now, Ramiro Gonzalez is scheduled to be executed by lethal injection in June 2026. Texas has remained firm in its stance, maintaining that the nature of his crime warrants the ultimate punishment. As that date approaches, Gonzalez's case continues to spark debates, not only about justice and retribution, but also about redemption and whether a final act of generosity should ever alter the outcome of a death sentence. Andre Thomas, Texas. Few death row cases in Texas, or anywhere, are as disturbing and psychologically complex as that of Andre Thomas. In March 2004, Thomas committed a horrific act that shocked even seasoned investigators. He murdered his estranged wife, Laura Boren, their 4-year-old son, and Laura's 13-month-old daughter, who was not his biological child. All 3 victims were brutally stabbed, and in a gruesome and ritualistic detail, Thomas removed their hearts before fleeing the scene. What followed only deepened the horror. Just days after the murders, while in custody, Thomas gouged out one of his own eyes with his bare hands. Years later, while incarcerated, he removed the other eye and reportedly consumed it. These acts drew international attention and raised immediate and profound questions about his mental state and whether he was fit to stand trial or to face execution. Despite his severe mental illness, which includes a diagnosis of schizophrenia and a long history of psychosis, Thomas was found competent to stand trial. Prosecutors argued that he knew right from wrong and acted deliberately. In 2005, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Over the years, his attorneys and numerous mental health advocates have fought to stop his execution, arguing that executing someone with such a documented history of extreme mental illness is unconstitutional and inhumane. Support for clemency has come from medical professionals, legal scholars, and even some conservatives who oppose capital punishment for the mentally ill. Yet, the state of Texas has continued to pursue the death penalty. Andre Thomas is currently scheduled to be executed by lethal injection in August 2026, although that date is pending a final ruling on his mental competency. If the courts find that his condition has deteriorated beyond legal standards for execution, the sentence could be halted indefinitely. His case remains one of the most chilling examples of the intersection between violent crime and untreated mental illness, and it continues to fuel debate over whether the justice system is equipped to handle the complexities of such extreme psychological conditions. Thomas Eugene Creech is one of the longest-serving death row inmates in the United States and one of the most prolific killers in Idaho's prison system. His criminal history spans decades in multiple states, with Creech himself admitting to dozens of murders, though only a handful have been officially confirmed. What sets him apart isn't just the body count, but the fact that one of his murders happened while he was already behind bars. Creech's known killing spree began in the 1970s, stretching from Oregon to Nevada and across Idaho. He was eventually convicted of multiple homicides, but it was a crime committed in 1981 that sealed his fate on death row. While serving a life sentence in an Idaho prison, Creech murdered a fellow inmate, David Jensen, a disabled prisoner who, by most accounts, posed no threat. Creech beat him to death with a sock filled with batteries, a brutal and calculated attack that shocked prison staff and solidified Creech's status as a danger even behind locked doors. That murder led to a capital murder conviction and a death sentence, handed down more than 4 decades ago. Since then, Creech has become a symbol of the debate around how long inmates should remain on death row and whether justice delayed is justice denied. His execution has been postponed numerous times over the years due to legal appeals, changing policies, and logistical issues with Idaho's execution protocol. Now, after more than 40 years of legal back and forth, the state of Idaho is moving forward. Thomas Eugene Creech is scheduled to be executed by lethal injection in September 2026. If the execution goes ahead as planned, it will mark one of the longest waits between sentencing and execution in U.S. history. For some, Creech's case represents closure for a string of brutal crimes. For others, it reignites the debate over the death penalty's effectiveness and cost. Either way, his name is one that will long be remembered in the history of American criminal justice. Donald Dilbeck, Florida. Donald Dilbeck's path to Florida's death row began with a violent escape and ended in an even deadlier act. In 1990, Dilbeck, who was already serving a life sentence for the murder of a sheriff's deputy, escaped from a prison work detail in Quincy, Florida. He was 27 years old at the time and had been incarcerated since he was a teenager. Just 2 days after his escape, Dilbeck crossed paths with Faye Vann, a 44-year-old woman sitting in her car in a mall parking lot in Tallahassee. He approached her, forced his way into the vehicle, and stabbed her to death in a failed carjacking attempt. The attack was both swift and brutal, carried out in broad daylight. He was apprehended soon after the murder and quickly charged with capital murder. At trial, prosecutors emphasized Dilbeck's violent past and the fact that he committed this crime while already serving time for another homicide. The jury didn't take long to reach a decision. He was convicted and sentenced to death. For over 3 decades, Dilbeck remained on Florida's death row, filing appeal after appeal, but the courts repeatedly upheld his conviction. Over the years, his defense team tried to argue that he suffered from neurological impairments and a history of trauma that should exempt him from execution. But none of those arguments succeeded in overturning his sentence. Now, after more than 30 years in prison, the state of Florida has scheduled Dilbeck to be executed by lethal injection in October 2026. His case stands as a grim example of what can happen when a violent inmate slips through the cracks and the lasting impact it leaves on victims' families and the justice system alike. The 2026 execution schedule is shaping up to be one of the most controversial in years, with mental health concerns, wrongful conviction claims, and evolving execution methods like nitrogen hypoxia. The U.S. death penalty system is under more scrutiny than ever. Each of these cases adds a layer to the national debate over justice and retribution. If you found this breakdown informative, hit that subscribe button and join the conversation in the comments. Do you think any of these cases deserve another look? Or are justice and closure long overdue? Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more in-depth true crime coverage, from courtroom drama to death row and everything in between.